to, coming from New Cairo to downtown here in Cairo is in this time. Actually, I think I've experienced the true definition of loss of productivity. So, and I think it's probably intentional so that I'm getting to the feel of it. So, sorry, Jim, for the delay. Welcome all to this very unique event of the loss of productivity claims in construction. And as you can see from the screen, this is a joint event, a CIArb event and a AACE International event. I'm wearing two hats here, so I'll start with CIArb. Back in September 2021, we made a poll to our members to ask, ask for what would be their preference in terms of the events that would hold in 2022. We had proposed a few topics in construction, a few topics in law, and two of the chosen topics by the members were loss of productivity claims and challenges to Law 182. Challenges to Law 182. We had held this event a few months back, and now we're holding this event in fulfillment of the members' choice. For AACE International, this event is really there's a lot of really in AACE International that offers, and that's a different I think webinar or seminar in its own rights. One of the things that AACE International provides is what is called the RPs, Recommended Practice, and it's a piece of work that is. It just provides to the construction industry recommended practices in several aspects of management. So just there are only 120 RPs, I believe, so far. And just to give you a glimpse of what I mean, so as you see on the screen here, there's RPs, and these are not in any preference, just random selection so that you get the feeling of what I mean. So there's an RP for cost estimate classification system, one for schedule classification system, forensic schedule analysis. This is one of the most popular or very popular RPs, which Mr. Zack here actually participated also in it. And there's the reviewing, validating, and documenting the estimate. There's determining activity durations. All these are RPs. And developing the project work breakdown structure, demonstrating entitlement for contract change orders or claims as applied in engineering, procurement, and construction. This is a very new one. This is RP 120 R21. Of course, there's the topic of today, the RP of today, which is estimating lost labor productivity in construction claims, which is authored by Mr. James Zack. Now, by way of introduction to Jim, there's this slide which I believe does not really give him the proper introduction. But if you can see here, he's a principal of James Zack Consulting LLC. And I really like the description of the company. So it's a construction claims consultancy assisting capital project owners and construction contractors in completing projects on the job site and not in arbitration or court. That I like with all respect, of course, to this being the Cairo Regional Center for Arbitration. But as engineers, we'd like to resolve disputes before they arise in arbitration or court. As you can see from the CV, like 50 years experience in construction management, involved in more than 5,000 claims, prepared GC 36 states and 39 countries abroad, fellow of AACE, of RICS, of the Society of Construction Claims Specialists, former president of AACE International. All of this is great. I just want to say one thing. I have known Jim since 2005. And being the expert that he is, he never once, when I asked him for any advice, never once was late in responding to me. He's always there. And I think he's a true professional and a true expert. So he's really someone that I admire personally and professionally. Okay, so We'll start with Jim. If you want to give a brief, any brief point of the argument before we go into the questions.
All right, thank you, Waleed, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. RP 25R03 was initially published in 2004. I worked on the draft along with an associate of mine, Donald McDonald, and it took us close to 2 years from scratch to publication. But the whole idea of this 30-page document is to try and set forth a variety of methods of analyze what causes lost productivity and various ways to analyze them and price them if you're going to be making a claim. Now, obviously, if you're pricing lost productivity claims, that means, generally speaking, you're a contractor who's lost productivity. But the reality is, the way we wrote it, we tried to write it in such a manner as that owners or employers, who are receiving such a claim can understand the methodology the contractor has used to determine whether or not the methodology in this particular case is viable or whether they should have used a different method. So the whole idea was to try and show how you can prove lost productivity on construction projects. And that's really what it was. It currently is undergoing revision, and the new document will be out sometime in the next year or so. It takes an inordinately long period of time in AACE to produce documents like this because we have to follow, there's like 4 levels of review and comment period. And, so it takes a long time to draft it and get it through the process. But within a year or so, I believe a new version will be out. The biggest change to the new version will probably be in all the appendices. If you have a copy of it, should have been made available to you. We had a large number of appendices listing studies or white papers. And since that was done in 2004 and we're in 2022, that's 18 years old. And there'll be a lot bigger appendices attached, which will allow folks to, if you're looking for example, the impact of overtime, there are many studies and papers on the lost productivity due to overtime, and more of them have come out. So that'll be probably the biggest change. But with that, you want to get into the questions, Waleed?
Sure, Jim. But first, I just want to mention the process that we went through. Is that when we did the research for the event, we asked to receive your questions first, and then so what we're going to do today is we're going to read the questions that we received, but we did not receive a lot of questions. So there are some questions that have been added that are RP specific. So we'll start with the RP specific questions, and then we're going to go into the more general questions. And if we have more time, we can answer some questions from here, from the hall, and also for online in the Q&A box for those who are joining through Zoom. So, okay, with that, I'll start. I'll share the screen to see the questions. So the first question is that in the RP there's a repeated reference, and this is of course one of my favorite topics, which is time bar clauses and condition precedent. So there's you generally mentioned in the RP several times the requirement for a notice that the contractor should submit to comply with the requirements in the contract for a notice. So can you please elaborate on the link between the notice requirements and the loss of productivity claim by a contractor?
Okay, putting it in the simplest form, most contracts around the globe have a series of notice requirements, notice of delay, notice of change, and things like that. And such requirements generally are written into contracts saying within 10 days of when the contractor knew or should have known, language of that sort, of the event, they have to provide written notice to the employer. Lost productivity is not as obvious as, say, an underground condition, or a directed variation. Those are discrete events. You know exactly when they start. Lost productivity is very subtle. And as a result, contractors frequently don't realize they've lost productivity until sometime toward the end of the project, and then and only then do they start to prepare and submit a claim. One of the biggest defenses employers use is what we call no notice, no claim. So if you're supposed to have given notice within 10 days of an event and you didn't give it for 190 days, they're arguing that you've lost your right. In some jurisdictions around the world, that is a legitimate argument. So that's the tie-in. If you don't track your productivity on a routine basis going through the project, you don't recognize that this is an issue that you should provide notice for, and you don't give it to the end, and suddenly the attorneys step in and say, well, gee, you should have provided this 9 months ago. You've lost your right. And an arbitration panel or a judge may agree, depending upon what jurisdiction you're in. So that's the tie-in, Waleed.
Another question is that you mentioned in the RP that one of the common causes of loss of productivity is acceleration. And when I read that for the first time, I was thinking that maybe acceleration should mean enhanced productivity because you're completing work in a shorter period of time. So it's very interesting that you mentioned that as one of the common causes of actual loss of productivity. Mm-hmm. So can you explain that part? How can acceleration result in a loss of productivity?
Okay. Acceleration often involves mandatory overtime, additional craft labor, and things like that. There have been a ton of studies, many of which are cited in the appendices on overtime, that show that long-term overtime actually decreases productivity. And one of the classic studies done years ago showed that if you went from a 40-hour week, say, to a 50-hour week, in the first 2 or 3 weeks, you're going to be more productive. Along about week 4, that's going to plateau and level out. And by about week 6, you're losing productivity. And by week 7 or 8, you're actually less productive than you were before you started to accelerate. That comes about because people are tired. They're making mistakes, which causes rework. So you have to, something's put in wrong, has to be torn out and then put back again correctly. More accidents, we've all been on sites where you have accidents on the site. That decreases productivity. Everybody's walking around on eggshells. And so that's what happens. If they bring more craft labor on site to accelerate, frequently, and this is probably true in Egypt, I know it's true in Europe and across North America, you've hired the best labor, the best qualified labor you can find. And if I have to bring more people on site with very little notice, they're going to be less qualified people. And so they're going to have to go through a much steeper learning curve. They're going to slow down or make the crews they're on less productive, and things like that. And if you bring on too many people, if you're working in a power plant, for example, where you try and put pipe welders, electricians in the same 200 by 200 foot space at a time, there's going to be a lot of conflict, and you interfere with each other. Each trade, depending on the nature of the trade, needs a certain amount of square footage to work efficiently, and you put too many workers in there and you're causing a loss of productivity. So that's why acceleration is actually a good cause, or prime cause rather, of productivity loss.
Thanks, Jim. It's very interesting. I also noticed that you used the word lost morale several times, which I thought was also interesting. Can you briefly explain this issue of lost morale among the laborers as a reason for loss of productivity?
Morale is a bit hard to define sometimes, but I think of morale as being the people on site are proud of what they're doing. They're I don't want to say, well, yeah, they're enjoying what they're doing. They believe that they and their employer are successful at doing these things. And when things start to go wrong, the craft labor on the site is looking around. I'm supposed to start this activity next Monday, and here it is Friday, and nobody has brought the material on site. So what am I supposed to do? So they start looking at the people in the trailers, saying, oh, project management guys, they don't have their act together. And so they stop working as effectively as they should, in some cases because they don't have the material there. In other cases, because they really don't trust the project management staff to provide their resources that they need. And so that's kind of lost morale. And there's a lot of things that can happen between a craft labor crew and the project management staff that can cause this, and productivity suffers.
We have received also this long question, which I'll read. It was mentioned that if the productivity factor is 75%, it does not necessarily mean that the contractor is 25% inefficient. I find this more understandable if you convert it in terms of cost. Here, wrong estimates, including but not limited to A, wrong assumptions, B, the estimator not being able to capture all the requirements of the work, including materials, labor, tools, equipment, accessories, methodologies, construction preparations, HSE, wastage allowances, and other factors contribute significantly to losses. The contractor who expects X% margin eventually finds itself only getting Y% margin in the end due to productivity losses. Such losses normally cannot be recovered in claims using measured mile and other similar approaches because they are internal problems that a contractor need to address themselves. What are your recommendations in minimizing, if not eliminating, unnecessary losses resulting from reasons not directly related to productivity rates, such as those mentioned above?
Okay, that's several questions in there. Let me start with the first one. I strongly agree that if the contractor is only 75% productive, that doesn't mean he's 25% inefficient. Productivity factors is calculated by measuring the actual productivity divided by the planned productivity. Whatever the plan is, that's 1. Anything less than 1 means you're being less productive. Anything more than 1 means you're being more productive. So it's the measure of actual labor productivity on an activity compared to the baseline plan. If I'm out there as an electrician installing conduit, for example, I'm supposed to install, and I'm actually installing 3 lineal feet of conduit per labor hour, but the plan is 4 lineal feet per hour, then I'm at 75% productivity. That's all. I agree that the baseline plan could be inaccurate. In fact, in working both for contractors and owners over the last 50 years, I've frequently found that the baseline plan is inaccurate. And if this is the case, the contractor, I agree, would not have entitlement to recover anything from the owner. One of the things I put into the PowerPoint slides I sent you is, what does a contractor have to do to recover any claim? Lost productivity, delay, you name it, any claim. First is entitlement. Something happened on the project that wasn't supposed to happen and was the fault of the owner, the employer, or somebody for whom the employer is responsible. Secondly, that event caused me as the contractor to do something I never would have done. And third, if you can tie those two together, it caused me to lose productivity on all the mechanical activities or something like that. If contractor cannot meet that burden of proof, they are not entitled to recover anything. So the latter part of this, yeah, I agree. If these things are the responsibility of the contractor, not anything the employer did, contractor's not allowed to recover. He shouldn't be allowed to recover. And the measured mile wouldn't be it would show the loss of productivity because that's all the measured mile is. It measures actual productivity against planned productivity. But the actual productivity loss the contractor has to show was the result of something the employer did or failed to do. So measured mile must show, yeah, sure, it's only 50% productive. But if the facts are, I had a poor plan to start with, there's no way I could have accomplished, 25 lineal feet of 12-inch conduit in an hour, then that's certainly not the employer's fault. So measured mile will tell you how unproductive they were, but the issue goes back to entitlement. Did the employer do something that caused that? My recommendations on minimizing unnecessary losses resulting from the reasons above, my guess is contractors need to be a darn sight more careful when they're preparing in offering a bid. Okay, they have to be realistic. One of the things I found with the larger contractors I've worked with in North America and Europe is, especially if they've been in business a long period of time, and Waleed, you and I worked for one of those contractors some time back. We kept very good records from project to project, and they were discrete, buildings, bridges, power plants, chemical facilities, and they kept very discrete records. And if if you're constructing a building that's supposed to have a stucco exterior, you go back and you look and find out the best stucco exterior we've ever produced was 300 square feet per day per stucco guy, and I'm going to bid 600 square feet per day. Well, that's my fault. That's ridiculous. I've never done it before. Why should I do it now? So contractors need to be very, very realistic. And I think that's a little more difficult to do these days. When I was much younger, I just turned 76. So, but when I was in my 40s, we didn't have the shortage of craft labor, experienced, skilled craft labor that we have today. And we could count on being able to have appropriate crews with folks that knew what they were doing. Today, you can't count on that. So you're going to have to make estimates that are more realistic. And that's the only way I could think to try and eliminate the damages, or not eliminate, to moderate the damages from lost productivity. That all falls on the contractor when you're offering preparing your tender offer.
Thanks, Jim. One of the thoughts I had when I was reading this question was that he or she asks that measured mile and the internal problems that a contractor is facing. And as you explained now your answer, you mentioned the contractor's estimate in the beginning, the planned productivity. But isn't measured mile also concerned with measuring the productivity at a time when there's no disruption, and then measuring the productivity at the time of disruption? In that case, the time of no disruption might not be the plan, right? It might be something. It's a more realistic account of the taking into account, and as the question, what is it taking into account the contractor's internal problems? But if you compare the actual productivity with the productivity at a normal, normal unimpacted state, would that, do you think, take care of these internal problems, or that's still in the hold?
Well, like I said, the internal problems are the problems that the contractor are self-imposed, and that comes in that first portion of making a claim, entitlement. Why am I not achieving the productivity I need to achieve in order to make money? Well, if my tender was wrong, how can I blame that on the employer? If I couldn't get enough qualified craft labor, but I assumed I could, how could I blame that on the employer? There's a lot of factors that contribute to this. And so the measured mile, like you say, that can demonstrate, run the numbers and give you a calculation. but you still have to prove that the loss of productivity was caused by the employer or somebody for whom the employer is responsible. And the reason I bring that latter part up is that many employers don't design the projects themselves. They use outside designers. So if you find a large number of errors, mistakes in the design, which slows down the construction process and causes lost productivity, the employer is going to say, well, I didn't design it. The fact of the matter is the guy who did design it worked for the employer. So the employer is liable to the contractor. Now, they may be able to go after the designer later on. That's an entirely different matter that I don't get involved in. But all I say, measured mile is simply, am I achieving my plan? That's all. But if I'm not, you have to do a deep dive to determine what caused the lost productivity. That's called entitlement. And that's an entirely different issue than, calculating lost productivity. That's an issue of what caused the loss of the productivity.
Okay, the RP emphasizes that it does not cover the impact of lost productivity on the schedule. And you mentioned several times, and first, this is a very interesting point. When you're talking about time impact analysis and the effect of productivity on the schedule, that's not covered in this RP. But I believe in the RP you do briefly address this point. So can you please clarify the link between a loss of productivity claim and a schedule delay analysis?
Okay, I agree with the issue, the statement that the recommended practice does not include schedule at all. That was not the intent. Our scope of work was just how do you calculate it. But I did prepare another webinar recently and made a presentation to a major electrical contractor out in the East Coast 2 months ago on this thing. What you can do is the tender, your base plan, has to assume activities, it has to assume units in activities, it has to assume materials, equipment, and it has to assume labor hours. So for each activity that is included in the tender, there is a sum of labor hours. And what you can do is you can track the actual labor hours to the planned labor hours for the activity and calculate the productivity using the productivity factor equation that I showed you in the slide. If, for example, my productivity on this set of activities is only 60%, that means I'm 40% below the target. You can take all of the remaining schedule activities from that trade or that portion of the work or whatever you're calculating and increase the duration of each of the remaining activities, the activities not yet started that are related to electrical, mechanical, structural, whatever it is, increase the durations by 40%. Make the assumption that the contractor cannot or will not recover the 40% loss. Increase the durations of all remaining activities of that type by 40%, which is easily done with today's software, and recalculate the schedule. Okay, it's kind of like a predictive TIA, if you will. What I'm trying to do is, okay, if electrical is 40% behind the curve, what's that going to do to the project? So you increase all uncompleted or all not started, rather, electrical activities by 40%, but duration, if they're supposed to be 10 days, are now 14 days, so on and so forth, and recalculate. And you may find, oh, wow, electrical now is suddenly the critical path, and I'm 149 days late. Now, where I've used this working for contractors, when I was doing claims for contractors, is we did this in-house. We never told the owner about it. We did it in-house. It was kind of a what-if game. And so that you could alert the senior management saying, hey guys, this is what's going to happen if you can't fix this problem. And if you catch it early enough as a contractor, you can do something about it. Change your means and methods, go find more labor, whatever the solution is. And there's a bunch of solutions, obviously. But that's what I mean. That would be the link between lost productivity and schedule delay analysis. Now, what I have done on the owner's side, when I get a delay claim at the end of the project and I'm working on behalf of an employer, one of the things that I've used my staff to do, or use the employer's staff to do, is go back and find out all the activities where productivity was lost, determine why, and then you find out the job is 180 days late, but 120 of those days were caused because you didn't ever come up to the mark on the amount of pipe welders that you're supposed to have on the project. Here's your plan. See, if I have a baseline plan that is labor loaded, and I only need to labor load the baseline, I don't need to do this every month through the project. I can back calculate how many pipe welders do I have to have, because I know the number of lineal feet of pipe that has to be welded on the project is my design. I know that. You can calculate that. You find out that, gee, they should have had 60 pipe welders on this job by month 5. And it should have stayed at 60 from month 5 all the way to month 20. That's what they would have had to do to make that schedule. If they only had 45, they're 25% below. That's not my fault as the employer. That's their fault. So you can use that as a reverse schedule delay analysis as a defense. So it works both ways. I can use it as a predictive model for the owner or the contractor, or a defensive model if the employer receives a lost productivity claim, or a delay claim rather, and you believe it's due to lost productivity, not the employer's fault. It cuts both ways.
Thank you very much, Jim. Another question is, what if the contractor intentionally slowed down and reduced the productivity of the manpower for a certain work package, knowing that he's going to get an extension of time for those works, change orders, variations? How would this be justified?
Do not know. I never faced this type of claim in Egypt, so I don't know how Egyptian law would cover this. I do know that in North America, our courts recognize what we call pacing delay. Pacing delay is defined roughly as the contractor deliberately slows down some work due to an anticipated or a known employer-caused delay. And they do it to stay slightly behind the employer's delay. The alternative is, I'm going to maintain my schedule. I don't care, Waleed, that this is, you're delaying my project. I'm going to maintain my schedule right up to the point where I have to drop tools and everybody goes idle because of your delay. Well, that's kind of harsh, and it drives the cost up, unreasonably. So the alternative is to pace. If you have a delay and I'm a contractor, I know about this delay, I have the choice of laying off people and trying to get them back 3 weeks from now, which probably isn't true, or I can slow down. Take some people, move them over here to do that, whatever, to keep the critical path activities slightly behind your delay. And that's called pacing. And there are a number of court cases in North America where the courts have determined, yeah, contractors entitled to do this. It's, unless the contract says you can't, obviously you're entitled to do it. So this may be why this would happen. If the intent of the question is that the contractor's artificially trying to increase the recovery of an EOT by doing something that they don't have to do, contractors would be found, the defense would be that the contractor did not mitigate the employer's damages. An unwritten rule of most contracts is both parties, owners and employers rather, and contractors, have an obligation to mitigate the damages to the other party. If I could solve a problem for $500,000, I'm not entitled to go out and spend $1.5 million and expect to complete my whole $1.5 million. And that's kind of a rough rule of thumb. And if that was the intent, and the employer could show the contractor deliberately did this simply to increase their recovery under the EOT, then you could argue their failure to mitigate damages. How that would be play out in an arbitration or a court in Egypt, not certain. I've never had that sort of claim when I worked there. But I think it would make sense as a good defense to a judge or to a panel of arbitrators, because these folks are all trained in contracts. Okay, if you go to law school, you spend like 2 or 4 semesters in contracts, right? And one of the rules in contracts is you can't deliberately do something that harms the other guy and expect to get paid for it.
Thank you, Jim. You raised some very interesting points. First of all, regarding pacing in North America, I think one of the requirements of the courts there is that the contractor must provide a notice first. Right, here we go again with the notice saying that they intend to pace. So if the contractor does not provide this notice and just this is at his or her own will, I think that affects, the compensation. But you know, as you mentioned, how does Egyptian law treat this? Of course, I would speculate. Of course, I'm no lawyer, but I would speculate that because the several words that you mentioned, like harm and the duty, and this is all going around the concept of good faith, which is a mandatory requirement in the law, and as you know, in a lot of civil law jurisdictions. And even as you're mentioning now, for a contractor to unnecessarily incur costs by just maintaining the same planned productivity, for example, that could be a bad faith in terms of the employer. But at the same time, for the contractor to intentionally not mitigate delays and exacerbate the situation, that can also be considered contrary to good faith from an employer's perspective. So I think that point is touching around the very concept of good faith, which is absolutely mandatory in Egyptian law and in all contractual situations. Okay.
The only thing I want to comment on, I have never seen a contract that requires that the contractor provide written notice of pacing to the employer. Okay, I know that pacing has been approved by courts in North America. What my recommendation is to all of my contractor clients is that even though the contract doesn't say you have to do this, if you're going to pace, tell the owner that you're pacing delay number 32, whatever delay number 32 is, and this is how I'm going to do it. So I recommend that to get around this idea of no notice, no claim, which is kind of a knee-jerk reaction of most employer attorneys or barristers rather. And so I'm trying to get around that. The other thing is where I've done this, working with a contractor, we've done this, we found out that once the employer recognizes the contractor is going to be doing this, this, and this, they start to work on solving their delay more promptly than they might otherwise work, because they don't want to pay any money out. So it serves 2 purposes. One is notice to protect the contractor, and the other is to give the employer the incentive, if you will, to go correct this doggone thing right here, right now, to save money.
Thank you, Jim. Another question was, what are the minimum requirements or evidences to properly estimate the disruption cost?
Yeah, estimate disruption cost. Ooh, okay. The minimum requirements, the minimum amount of evidence to properly estimate disruption costs goes back to the fundamental three-part test for a claim, which is true in Egypt, because I have done claims in Egypt, representing both employers and contractors. Number one, again, entitlement. The employer did something they weren't supposed to do or failed to do something they were supposed to do. And when I say employer, that means anybody that they're responsible for, obviously, which entitles the contractor under the terms of the contract to recover cost and or time. Okay, so that's the first test. The second leg of the test is causation. That thing that the employer failed to do caused me to do this over here, something I never would have done had the employer done what they promised to do in the contract. Causation is the tie-in between entitlement and damages. Okay, and then you have to prove that what the employer failed to do caused me to do this, which in turn disrupted. I had to shut down this activity over here because you didn't respond to a request for clarification. I moved the crew across the site to work on that activity. That cost me money. I had to move the crew back to the original location when you finally gave me a response. That cost me money. And by the way, that your response was so late, it moved me into the wet season. Okay, or into a winter season, or into a season where the craft labor doesn't work as efficiently as they do in other seasons. An example, I live in northern Colorado. Behind these curtains, when I open up, there's a big window there, and I look out on a 14,000-foot mountain. Okay, it is not uncommon in the middle of winter to reach 0 degrees Fahrenheit or below down here where I live. Now, I can place concrete below 0 degrees, but I have to tell you, it's a lot more expensive. And if that sort of disruption, moving it, say, from September to January, and I'm placing the same concrete, that's a huge disruption. And I can calculate the cost and the time related to that. So, entitlement, causation, and resulting damages. That's the three-legged stool. The claimant, whether it's the contractor making a claim against an employer or an employer making a claim against the contractor, must prove all three to get the first dollar or the first day. It's not like if I prove 2 out of 3, I get 2/3 of my money. It doesn't work that way. You have to prove all three to get the first dollar or the first day, and that's the minimum requirement to estimate the disruption cost. You're going to have to, if I'm arguing that I've been disrupted and it's cost me $100,000, I'm going to have to show that that disruption was the result of something for which the employer or somebody who the employer is responsible for did or failed to do, and that caused me to do this sort of stuff over here, and the result is $100,000 of disruption. And then I'm going to have to prove the disruption somehow. And that's the issue of the recommended practice, a variety of ways to prove the disruption. The best, in my opinion, being measured mile, but that's not always possible, obviously, because I've been on projects that in the first 30 days of the project, you give the employer gives the contractor 3 change orders. So we never really had an undisrupted period, but that's the elements of this thing, and that's outlined more in the PowerPoint summary that I gave, I think, that in the RP.
Thanks, Jim. I'll take a question from the Q&A just to shake things a little. So, can time at large claim be one of the recourse to increase productivity? If not, loss of productivity can be the biggest challenge. I think it not loss, there's something wrong in the sentence there. But can time at large be one of the recourse to increase productivity?
I'm trying to see if I can find that question. Just in the Q&A section.
It's in the Q&A by EK. Engineer.
Can a time at large?
Yeah.
Oh, can a time at large claim be one of the recourses to increase productivity? I've never seen that. Having been in the claims business for 50 years, I can tell you almost anything's possible, but I think that it's probably not likely that it would increase productivity. As in my recollection of a time at large claim, and I've been involved in a few of these, is when the employer causes a delay, refuses to acknowledge the delay, requires you to finish on time, which is classified as a breach of the employer's duty to grant time extensions or EOTs. And all that does is it removes the mandatory end date. So if the end date doesn't change, if the end date is no longer applicable or enforceable in the contract, all I'm required to do is to finish the project within a reasonable period of time. So I don't know that that will necessarily lead to an increase in productivity. It might, if the contractor wants to get out of there faster, or something like that. EOT, would the loss of productivity be the biggest challenge? If you tie loss of productivity to schedule delay, or EOT requests rather, as I tried to illustrate earlier, and the employer absolutely refuses to acknowledge their obligation to grant you an EOT and then threatens you, if you don't finish by July 1st, I'm going to terminate for default or something like that. You still face the challenge of demonstrating the loss of productivity was caused by something the employer did or didn't do. It caused you to do something you wouldn't have done. And, oh, by the way, I lost productivity and I'm going to have to be able to price that productivity loss. So that, I'm not sure that changes that equation at all.
Thanks, Jim. In Egypt, we don't have a time at large, but we do have concepts that will result in the same conclusion of not having an end date and completing within a reasonable period of time. And as you've mentioned in the RP, I think what's analogous to this is probably this loss of morale, or I would think that a time at large situation would result in reduced productivity, because from my experience, the contractor submits several claims and the claims go unanswered, and the contractor does not have a target, and I would think that this demotivation or loss of morale will trickle down from the management to the labor, because they want a target to work towards, but they don't have one because simply say the engineer did not process a claim, did not respond to a claim, and of course going behind the scenes maybe did not process a claim because the engineer has his own issues with the owner, for example, or so all these things. I would actually agree with you that probably it would result in a reduced productivity. Not I have never seen a contractor who would say, okay, now I'm going to increase my workforce, or I'm going to work very hard to get out of that project. A contractor, I think a lot of times does not want to unnecessarily spend costs. So I want to take a question from the audience. Is there a microphone? Okay. I think in the back.
So I just want to create.
Can you hear Jim? Can you hear
No, it's breaking up.
Hello. Loss of productivity.
When I try to raise my voice, maybe it's
Maybe if you want to come in the front to speak on this one.
take a question from the audience. Zoom first.
No, because if they what's
Maybe, what I wanted to ask is basically the measured mile.
measured mile? Sorry.
So the measured mile basically compares the planned productivity of the contractor during the tender or the baseline versus the actual impacted period.
Yeah.
So what I believe and what I have participated in the loss of productivity claims in my company earlier, we adopted a more proactive and practical approach that was more appealing to the employer and the consultant, which is comparing the actual unimpacted period versus the actual impacted period, so that we remove all exaggeration from the contractor's perspective and whatever errors during the tender stage or so. My question is, wouldn't that be a more realistic, a more proactive approach from the contractor side, and it's even more evidence appealing to the when it reached the court or to any tribunal? Okay. Did you hear the question, Jim, as well?
Yeah, I think I understand it. I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding over measured mile. Measured mile never uses the contractor's estimate, never relies upon the productivity in the contractor's tender. What the measured mile does is take the actual productivity your craft labor accomplished in the field once they're past the learning curve, obviously, because when we first go on site, we all have a learning curve. But once you're past learning curve and you accomplish an unimpacted productivity for this set of activities, and an event occurs, and the measured mile literally measures the difference between the productivity that your crew actually accomplished before the event and what they're now accomplishing after the event. For example, I was looking at a claim that an electrical contractor was making on a major wastewater treatment facility where there was what they call utilidors, concrete culverts underground. All the piping went through there. And the original design had a particular type of pipe hanger specified in it. And the electrical crews were putting the pipe hangers into the ceiling of the utilidors with no problem. They were reaching, a reasonable production rate. But then the employer, somebody told the employer about this brand new type of pipe hanger, which was more efficient and this, that, and the other. And so the employer directed the contractor to use the new type of thing. And we measured what the contractor was installing before this variation and what he installed after the variation. And actually it took 22% longer to install each pipe hanger. Now, pipe hangers may not sound particularly important. The trouble was there was 25,000 pipe hangers on this project. So when you're taking longer on each one of those, that's a huge loss of productivity. And so all it measures is what did your crew actually accomplish before the event and what is it accomplishing now after the event. It doesn't consider the contractor's tender calculations. See, the trouble with contractors trying to compare productivity in the field to what they offered in the tender is the argument you're going to run into. Well, boy, you really blew that bid, didn't you? You don't know anything about productivity, right? You know, there's no way in heck you could have possibly made that production rate. Nobody's ever done that. And so, you know, now you're going to argue whether your tender estimate was in fact accurate. That's what the measured mile study tries to get around. We don't care what you tendered. What we care about is what did your crew actually accomplish for 4, 5, 6 months before the event, and then now that the event's taken place, what are they accomplishing now? And that differential, which can only be blamed on this event for which you're responsible, Mr. Employer, that's the loss of productivity. And I'm going to price it out in time off the schedule. I'm going to price it out in additional labor costs, additional material costs, whatever, you know, was driven by the event. And that was the kind of neat thing about measured mile when it was first created back in the 1960s, because it didn't rest on somebody's tender offer, which may or may not be accurate. I mean, I don't know how many of your folks in the audience are contractors, but have you ever had a perfect tender offer, one in which every unit in there came in exactly as planned, and the pricing was perfect, and labor productivity was never impacted? That doesn't happen. That's why we call them an estimate, right?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jim. We'll take a question from the slides. You mentioned in the RP that after detecting loss of productivity, the contractor must first validate that the productivity in the bid proposal is correct before comparing it to the actual or lost productivity. And the RP mentions also that it is necessary to do this step in order to avoid the situation of a contractor comparing site productivity to one of what you called a flawed baseline. So, and you actually, as you were answering the questions now, you mentioned that you have come across several times where a contractor's baseline is flawed. So, how, in your experience, how often do contractors fall into this trap of not validating the bid productivity? You make it seem in the RP like this is something that has to happen. I mean, as you just said, mentioned right now, probably it can lead to embarrassing results to contractors. But how often, in your experience, do you find that contractors do not really validate their planned productivity?
Well, this is a mistake that is all too frequent when dealing with, excuse me, lost productivity claims. The issue here is the underlying assumption that the as bid or as planned labor productivity is both reasonable and achievable. And that's not always a good assumption. And it is one that, frankly, most employers will take serious exception to when you're arguing over the negotiating table, or if you go into a DAB, you know, or arbitration or litigation. The best way is to use another form of measurement of productivity. Measured mile is one. Surveys, you know, craft labor surveys, industry studies, things like that. But if you really want to rest on your as planned productivity out of the tender offer, you're going to have to be able to, as you say, you're going to have to be able to validate it. Now, one way to validate it, if you're a very well-experienced contractor, if you've built let's say a dozen or more surface water treatment facilities, and you've got very discrete records of productivity for all of the activities that go with a surface water treatment plant, and you've taken, for piping, for example, you've taken all 12 of your projects and run a calculation that averages the productivity for pipe installation at a surface water treatment plant and come up with this number, and then you use that number in preparing the tender offer for the new project, then you may be able to demonstrate that's a valid number. I didn't pull this out of my ear. I'm not trying to argue that I, am Superman and I can install twice as much as I ever installed in the history of my company. Most contractors, however, in my experience, don't keep that type of record from past projects. And frequently, the estimating staff, if you don't have the numbers, the next mistake the estimating staff makes, which is very costly in this regard, is they don't go talk to experienced superintendents. They talk to other project managers who've been on these jobs like that. But a project manager is not necessarily in the field actually watching the craft labor do all these activities. They don't go down to the superintendent level and say, hey, we got 12-inch conduit on this thing. How many feet per day or per hour can a guy install? They don't get that. So when they try and compare the alleged productivity loss to the as planned productivity from the tender offer, people are going to say, where the heck did you get that number? And I took it out of an estimating manual. Well, there's a ton of estimating manuals in the United States, and they give you average cost, everything from Alaska to Key West, Florida, 4,000 miles, entirely different weather patterns. An average is an average, folks. It's not reliable. It could be a starting guideline, perhaps, but it's not reliable if you're going to go to arbitration or litigation. And so that's why I say, don't rest the loss of productivity on your estimate unless you can prove that the estimate is based on a lot of history that your company's actually achieved. Base it on what did my guys actually achieve in the field before variation number 13 was issued, or before we had this 6 weeks delay, or whatever it was. Now what am I getting?
Thank you, Jim. One of the questions in the Q&A box by Sagar Raoult is, why did the RFP did not elaborate on systems dynamics as mentioned in the Society of Construction Laws protocol?
First of all, the RP preceded the SCL protocol by several years. Secondly, at the time that I wrote it, no court case in the United States had accepted systems dynamics as a matter of proof. So that's why we set it aside. Now, there have been some cases since where systems dynamics have been introduced as evidence. We know that the contractor won the claim, but unfortunately, when our judges issue decisions, they don't always tell you why they sided with the contractor versus the employer. There are a number of very good papers on systems dynamics. And in fact, when I was with a major global contractor, we used systems dynamics to assess productivity issues on a major claim. It was a $350 million claim. And complicated. It tended to prove what we thought it would prove. The reality of the situation was we were going to go into a jury trial. 12 people pulled off the streets of Detroit at random in a jury. And we were having trouble explaining systems dynamics to other engineers and to attorneys. And we're thinking, you're never going to be able to explain that to a jury? I don't know. Think about it. If you went to a trial, if you went to say an arbitration in Cairo, the panel is going to be what? 3 attorneys, right? 3 barristers. You want to try and explain that systems dynamics to 3 lawyers? I think it's not a bad system, but it is really, really complex. And the issue for a contractor trying to make a claim is the contractor has to provide reasonable proof to the trier of fact, whether it's a DAB, a DRB, mediator, arbitrator, court, In your case, you don't do juries, so it would be to a judge. If I can't understand this system, be able to explain it, it's not worthwhile to use. Now, if you're in a situation where you're, say if you're working with a major oil company, private money, they're not under any government restrictions on, on this sort of thing. You're dealing with some pretty sophisticated folks. I mean, somebody like Exxon or somebody like that, they've been in business for 100 years. They spend billions of dollars a year. They have some very sophisticated executives. You might be able to use systems dynamics in that sort of a setting, but I think it would only work in negotiation. Because you want to be able to deal face to face with the guy across the table who would possibly understand this. I don't want to go into court or go into arbitration where, the trier of fact is an attorney or a panel of attorneys and rest my whole case on that. So that's why we didn't include it. One of the fellows in AACE recently, within the last 8 or 9 years, did get a doctorate, and his doctoral thesis was on systems dynamics. And it is a tremendous piece of work. So there are people who are looking into this. And in the gentleman, Waleed, you may know him, Steve Warho.
Yeah.
Yeah, Steve wrote his doctoral thesis on that. He may be working on an RP for this. I don't know. I haven't talked to Steve since last, I guess it was last June, when we saw each other at the AACE annual meeting. But basically, that's why we didn't put it in there, because we couldn't find any court cases where a court or a board of contract appeals had accepted systems dynamics as evidence. And when we really looked into it, we thought, man, I don't know if you could explain this to a bunch of attorneys on an arbitration panel successfully. Not to say that there's anything wrong with it. If you got the data, it's good. But it's not gonna be an easy sell in arbitration or litigation.
Thank you, Jim. Here, a question. I can take the mic. Everyone is okay. Let's take another question from the Q&A. We have Waleed Aziz, who is the Greater Cairo AACE president. He says most causes mentioned in the RP are related to contractor's responsibility and control. But if the contractor paying for it, he have a very accurate system identifying each activity, the time spent, etc. Then compare it with the approved schedule. Can you elaborate on what the contractor should be ready with based on your wide experience in construction?
Okay. Well, first of all, I take exception to the first sentence here. Most of the causes that we put in the RP are actually brought about by the employer or some outside force for which the employer might be responsible. But the idea here of what should a contractor do to be ready? What I recommended in the webinar that I recently completed, and I presented a live version of it to this electrical contractor on the East Coast, is that once the contract is awarded to the contractor, the project superintendents should meet with the estimating staff and go through all of the activities in their scope of work: electrical, mechanical, structural, civil, all the activities, whatever they are, and then find out how many units for each activity did the estimator include, and how many labor hours. Okay, and from that, the superintendent can run a quick calculation. Oh, to get this number of labor hours into that number of units, each person has to be doing X. Now you have a baseline to go out in the field. Superintendents are paid to watch their staff, right? And if it's a general superintendent and all that stuff, he can give that information to craft labor foreman, and then they can start tracking it. And if they find, hey, we're supposed to be getting 30 feet an hour and we're only getting 22, they need to notify the superintendent and talk to this, and the superintendent talks to the project manager and find out, why are we only getting 22? Now, if that's the contractor's fault, you better cure that fault. But if it's something the employer did, then give notice, start tracking it, modify your schedule to show the 22, the impact of 22 feet per hour versus 30 or whatever, and start calculating it that way. But the bottom line is that all too frequently, the folks that estimate a job don't ever meet with the field staffs that are building the job. So the field staff goes out there, they know their scope of work, they know that they have to place 32,000 cubic yards of concrete over the next 9 months. Yeah, that's fine. And they know it has to be placed in certain locations, but nobody's ever told them what the planned labor spread or equipment spread or anything like that was. And as a result, they're out there, yeah, hey, I accomplished 700 cubic yards rather of concrete in place today, man, that's great. They don't know that you're supposed to accomplish 900 because they've never been given the data. Today's software management systems in the construction industry can be easily filled out to provide data like that to superintendents or foremen on a craft basis. They can go ahead and track it, and in the minute something starts to go wrong, have the project management staff come out and figure out why. Okay. And if it's the employer's fault, send notice and start the process of demonstrating entitlement, causation, and damages. Trouble is, like I say, too much of the industry, they put a lot of software in estimating. They put a lot of software in construction management or project management. They don't necessarily tie the two together. And most importantly, they don't tell the superintendents and the foremen out in the field what the target is. They tell them the schedule side. Hey, by next Monday, you guys have to have done this, this, and this. They'll tell them that because that's a kind of a weekly, part of that 3-week look ahead. But they don't tell you anything about, well, you're supposed to be able to do so many craft hours per lineal foot of excavation in order to be able to accomplish what you need to have in place by next Monday. And there's a disconnect in the communications. And so that, I think you need to fix that disconnect, and then reasonably well-experienced superintendents and foremen can track it. Okay, they may not know exactly why they're not hitting the target, but they ought to be able to tell you, you've given the data, they ought to be able to tell you, we're not hitting the target, boss. And then project management staff, variation, the engineers responsible for pricing variations. There's always staff around who can go out and do an analysis and figure out the why. And like I said, if it's the contractor's just not doing the job right, fix it. If the contractor is trying to do the job right, but the employer has done something that stands in his way, send notice and start preparing a variation request.
Thank you, Jim. I have a question. In the RP, you said that one of the common causes of loss of productivity are the delayed replies by the engineer to the contractor's RFIs, or to clarifications. So I think you called it defective engineering. One of the thoughts that crossed my mind is, can we consider that a contractor who has engineering problems and therefore has problems producing shop drawings, and this results in loss of productivity? Can this result in loss of productivity? And would that be a sort of self-inflicted loss of productivity, for example? So you mentioned engineering, but I think that wouldn't that work also the contractor is harming himself by, say, having a weak engineering team and they cannot, turn out the shop drawings, get them approved because of the team.
If the design is not flawed, contractor prepares shop drawings, submittals, sends them to the engineer, and the engineer writes stuff back saying, oh, no, you can't do this, you can't do that, you misunderstood this. That could be a constructive variation. But if the engineering is basically sound, the contractor prepares sloppy submittals, or submittals that really don't cover everything they're supposed to cover, and the engineer rejects it and says redo it, it could lead to loss of productivity, and that would be a self-imposed loss of productivity. It's not something the employer or their design team is responsible for. The design's okay. Contractor's submittal was not okay. And I've been on, one of the big projects I worked on the West Coast for several years. My client, who was the employer, got a little bit upset with the way contractors are just, especially they weren't reviewing subcontractor submittals. They just, they get it in the door and 9 in the morning, and at 10 it's on the way over to the owner. They never even opened it. So what that employer decided to do, they wrote into the specification that anytime they have to do a third review of the same submittal, they started charging actual damages. You know what happened? Contractors sharpened up their submittal system. Their own submittals got a lot better, and the subcontractor submittals got a lot better. But what was going on is that everybody was just throwing anything in to try and see if the owner would buy it, the employer would buy it, and it didn't work. And if that's the case, Waleed, you're right. There's no entitlement there for your own screw up. You can't shoot yourself in the foot and ask somebody else to pay for it.
Well, Jim, you know what? I've told you this a million times, and I think one of my favorite articles that you've written is the one about claimsmanship, and we had an event about it, and it's I don't know how to praise it enough, but one of the tactics that you mentioned contractors do is this use of RFIs. I don't know if it was in the claimsmanship article or in another article, but the abundance of false RFIs, so that it appears like there's a lot of RFIs, but actually the content is there's no really content. It's just for show that there's 2,000 RFIs for the project. Do you think that kind of practice can lead to loss of productivity, this time on the owner side or the engineer side, or how do you think that impacts does this kind of result in any loss of productivity of any type?
Well, unanswered RFIs typically can cause productivity loss as well as potential delay, especially if the RFI has to do with a critical path item. Too many RFIs, well, I don't know. It could cause loss of productivity because the contractor's staff is trying to create a bunch of phony RFIs instead of working with the field craft labor to build the project. What I've found is that if a contractor is really playing games with RFIs and they're submitting one of the papers that you mentioned, I took a real life case example where I was employed as an expert witness, where the contractor had submitted literally 4,000 RFIs, and then was trying to say, well, the job wasn't fully designed, and when you put it out for tender and you finish the design at my expense through the RFI process and all that garbage. And what happened there is that the team that I worked with, we analyzed each RFI and put them into a variety of categories and found out that a tremendous number of them are what we called fishing expeditions. They submitted RFI 293. They got a response they didn't like, so they gave it a new number, waited a week, changed some of the language in the question, and resubmitted, hoping it lands on somebody else's desk and gets the right answer from their perspective, that is. That sort of stuff went on. Anyway, bottom line is that out of 4,000 RFIs, only about, I don't know, I think the number was something like 200, 180 to 200 were legitimate RFIs. The rest were just gamesmanship. Out of that tranche of RFIs, all of them were all but a handful were responded in a timely manner, and couldn't possibly have led to a delay because of the response time. And out of that even smaller tranche, half of them had already resulted in change orders or variations. In other words, the RFI was legitimate, and the employer looked at it and said, oh, darn, I need to make a variation. You know, this guy's brought something to my attention we didn't catch. And so they'd already settled the variation. So we were only left with, I don't know, 10 or 20 that we actually had to do any real analysis on. And now the bottom line is that productivity on the employer's side was substantially impacted. We had one project that I was on. We got this wonderful contractor, and I knew the owner of the construction company. Personally, he was a delightful fellow to be with. He really was. But they bid this job, and the day after the contract notice to proceed was given, they walked in with 200 RFIs, many of which should have been questions during the tender period, but they didn't do that. They saved them. And it totally overwhelmed the employer staff and their design staff. That's a loss of productivity on that side. So while they're tied up doing that stuff, the employer and their designer are not doing stuff that they should have been doing. So there could be a loss of productivity there. Unfortunately, I've never never seen a contractor or an employer could make a loss of productivity claim against a contractor for playing these games, but that happens. So loss of productivity, to some extent, can be a two-edged sword, and that in that case, it was.
Yeah, I think there's a first time for everything, and the example you mentioned, I mean, that I think it would cause havoc among the employer's team. And yeah, my question definitely was targeting loss of productivity to the employer's team and the engineer's team. Because I can imagine like those 2,000 or 3,000 RFIs, and that would really cause havoc to the engineering team. Yeah, it's this is a very interesting. What you mentioned, the day after the notice to proceed, 200 RFIs. I mean, being an Egyptian, I'll just tell you, this is outright bad faith. You know, like this is like, so the contractor had actually had these questions stored and kept them until just getting the award and raising them after the award, and that's pretty bold.
Well, I can tell you that if you think that's outright bad faith, you're being much more polite than I was as an American. I had some much stronger words about that contractor. But yeah, it happens.
Yeah, we have a very interesting question I apologize for that. VBAV. I'm gonna stop here. It's actually trying to saying COVID impact on loss of productivity due to client event. How can we analyze? So I think the interesting part of this question: how can you distinguish loss of productivity due to COVID from a loss of productivity due to a typical one due to a employer, for example?
I'm sorry, run that by me again. Like, I can't find the question on my screen.
It's on by VD, and it was 7:13 p.m. and it says COVID impact and loss of productivity due to client event. how can we analyze? So I think it's how can we analyze a loss of productivity due to COVID, for example, as opposed to client events?
Wow. COVID is still an unresolved issue in construction in the United States. I have not yet seen a court case that really deals properly with COVID. The issue here is that COVID in the US is classically dealt with as a force majeure event. And as a result, the best the contractor is likely to get is a time extension, but no time-related damages and no loss of productivity. But having said that, if you're losing productivity due to COVID, I can understand that. The intermittent shutdown of construction projects. A friend of mine who is a contractor's project manager in New York City, in downtown New York City, couldn't get craft labor to the site because New York State shut down anybody crossing state lines. And if you've ever been to New York City, if you go across one river on the east side, the west side, you're in New Jersey. If you go across another river on the east side, you're in Connecticut. So most of their craft labor actually couldn't come show up. So yeah, COVID is easily provable as a loss of productivity. But the bottom line is that I'm not seeing FIDIC, for example, we examined that form of contract. There is no way for a contractor to recover productivity loss costs for that. Because it's classified as a force majeure, and FIDIC's pretty straightforward to the point: time, no money. But if you're in a situation where you have a mix of COVID productivity losses and some losses caused by the employer, failure to respond to RFIs or something like that, you're going to have the entitlement portion of the claims formula says you're going to have to be able to demonstrate that the event you're complaining about was the responsibility of the employer or somebody for whom they're responsible, and they didn't do what they said they would do under the contract, and that caused me to do this, and that lost productivity. So you're going to have to sort it out, and you may have to do it event by event. One of the things that happened locally here, I was talking to a construction contractor last year about this time. Due to the spacing requirements, you have to have so many feet between, craft labor on site, 20 feet or whatever it was. And he was doing a mid-rise commercial office building. And he was talking about the COVID impact. And said, "Oh, how does that affect you?" And he said, the bottom line is each working space, because it's commercial, so it's all office space. Each one was so small, I had to have all my subcontract trades go through all 4 floors in the building and be out of here before I brought the next subcontractor. And he had to be all 4 floors done before they brought the next subcontractor. And he said, typically, my framing contractor, get them on floor 3 and you bring in the rough-in for MEP. And those guys can go up and they'll be up on floor 3 and I can start bringing in the sheetrock guys. But the building size wasn't big enough to allow me to do that. Total loss of productivity, huge delay under an AIA contract, American Institute of Architects contract. What he got was time, no money. He lost his butt economically on the project. So you'd have to be able to sort out productivity loss caused by COVID versus productivity loss caused directly by the employer or somebody they're responsible for. That may not always be very easy. But if you want to recover anything other than time, you'd have to make that distinction and prove it.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Yes, okay. Hello?
So it's really interesting back to the point where the employer can issue a loss of productivity claim to the contractor. So is it legitimate under the civil law and the Egyptian laws, Dr. Waleed?
I believe it's perfectly legitimate because this is an action by the contractor that has affected or harmed the employer, caused darar, and probably can be quantifiable. It's a challenge, I think, to prove the quantum, but
I'm talking about the principle itself.
yeah, the principle, yeah, I think it's definitely why not? Because for example, the example we have taken, say this 1,000 RFIs, or you can imagine the engineers team that were dedicated to answer the RFIs, and I can imagine the scenario in my head. So you have those. Say if it's one of those design firms that we know, local design firms, and they have a dedicated team to answer those RFI, to address the engineering. But now with those thousands of RFIs, they have to get more, maybe hire more employees and expand their the personnel, and it's all like phony because it's the number, but the content is actually so it would consume a lot of hours and unnecessarily. So I think it's definitely if that claim is made, and I think it would definitely work.
Maybe I think, in my opinion, I'm not sure, but it can be used in terms of a rebuttal analysis to one of the contractor's claims when the contractor submits extension of time. Maybe it can be used in this sense. But issuing a claim, loss of productivity to the contractor, I mean, there is a mechanism under any contract regarding the extension of time and delays and whether they are excusable days or non-excusable. So maybe it can be used for the employer to prove that it's non-excusable due to this and this and this. But issuing the loss of productivity claim to the contractor, and the contractor is the one who really know his rates, who can actually quantify the productivity and what's exactly lost. So I mean, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to prove from the employer's perspective.
You bring up several interesting points. The first point is that remember in the federal contract, for example, we have a clause, or the 99, now it's no longer there, but 99, we have the employer's claims. And so in that case, the employer would make a claim, and the employer, on the contrary, knows exactly the productivity that is lost, because you're talking here about the lost productivity of the consultants, engineers, the people who are hired to review the RFIs. Now you have to hire more people. Now there's as Jim calls it in the RP, there's a loss of morale, loss of, they're overwhelmed by the number of the RFIs. So they're taking more time to review. So even if there's a straightforward RFI, they're probably reviewing it in a more time, because now they're under pressure of being late in the RFIs, and there's a claim against them. And so the engineer, the consultant here can definitely quantify the win for a contractor's claim. Remember that, again, if we talk about the FIDIC 1999 clause 2.5, the employer needs to make the notice and the particulars as soon as practicable. And there have been in England, there's a case where actually as soon as practicable in that sense is even more strict than the 28 days for a contractor, because that soon as practicable notice and particulars can be 7 days. So if a contractor submits his claim in 2 months, for example, and this a flood of RFIs has been happening for those 2 months, a contractor can argue, Mr. Employer, you're time barred. This is not reasonable as practical. These are some points. But thanks a lot for the question. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yara?
Okay, it's working. Yeah. So you mentioned, Mr. James, something like relating to trust and loss of productivity, and like morale, also decrease in morale. So these are reasons of a qualitative nature. So what other reasons would reasons of qualitative nature would be cause a huge impact on productivity, and how impactful would they be in arbitration or negotiations? Thank you.
Well, let's see, if you look at both the RP and the PowerPoint we sent out, things like absenteeism, competition for craft labor, craft turnover, crowding and stacking trades, dilution of super, these are all qualitative measures and not as opposed to quantitative. Fatigue, again, qualitative. And if you can demonstrate that this happened because of something the employer did, then, I know of many claims I've been involved in where we were able to demonstrate that the employer was actually the cause of these things and would have been able to recover. The key in my mind is the contractor's field staff recognizing this as it starts to happen so that you can really track it and trend it rather than waiting till the end of the job, 18 months later, saying, oh gosh, we were really not very productive on our concrete placement. And somebody says, well, that's because the employer did this and did that. Did we file notice? Should we have known? Stuff like that. So that's the key, is making sure that the folks in the field, and here I'm talking about superintendents and craft foremen, understand what the targets are and how the targets for each activity were calculated, and then tracking to make sure that, hey, if this is not happening, get the project management team out there to look at it, figure out why, what can we do? Is it the employer's fault? Is it our fault? Is it the fault of one of our subcontractors or vendors? If you think about a construction site, there was a court case, late 1960s, in which a federal judge commented that nowhere in the accomplishments of man is there more complicated organizational structures than construction. And I've been on projects where we had 50 or 60 subcontractors, vendors, suppliers, in addition to the general contractor. And gosh, everybody it's like a ballet. Everybody has to do it right at the right time and in the right way. And the bottom line is that doesn't happen. That's why I've been a claims consultant for 50 years. I only get involved in projects that go bad. It's very complicated. But the thing about it is whether it's qualitative or quantitative, the folks in the field, the people keeping the records in the field, superintendents and foremen, must know what the targets are and how they were calculated so they can keep track of it and then run up a flag saying, hey, boss, this is not happening right. I need some help. And that's, to me, is the flaw in the system. We don't often enough tell the field supervisors what's the goal, what's the target, how did we get there, what did we calculate. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Jim. Of course, as you know, as I stepped in the hall, I was under the threat of liquidating damages because of me. And now I'm afraid that we will be collectively under threat of unliquidated damages from the Cairo Regional Center because of the delay that was caused from my delay. So we'll just take one more question from the Q&A, and I think there's a lot of questions. So I think, Jim, maybe we can dedicate, maybe answer them separately. Jim has, by the way, mentioned that he'd be willing to answer the other questions. We were discussing how that happened, but we have a record of all the questions that were made, so we'll strive to answer as much as we can. Or Jim will try to answer as much as they can.
Oh, you can jump in, Waleed, and take some of them yourself if you want.
Yes, sir. Okay, there's a question by Muhammad Darthman saying, does loss of productivity necessarily entail a delayed completion? That's in MO Jim there. Does loss of productivity necessarily entail a delayed completion? For example, loss of productivity could be on a non-driving resource and non-critical, but entail a loss of productivity.
The answer in my experience is no. Lost productivity does not always end up in project delay. And I think the first time I actually faced that issue, 1980, 1981, I was heading up a claims team for a major employer in the northern part of the United States, working on a waste treatment project. We had to build an island in the middle of Lake Michigan in order to create the land to put the waste treatment plant on. And once we got done with that, they bid the actual, treatment plant work. Sometime relatively early in the job, the contractor provided a submittal. The employer did not answer within the contractually mandated time. In fact, they were like 2 months or so late in providing the answer. The result was concreting, which should have been done in October, November timeframe that year, which is chilly. It's cold, but it's not down to sub-zero freezing. Got pushed into January and February. So the contractor files a productivity loss claim. And what we did the analysis on is that this set of activities had a tremendous amount of float on it. So even though the employer was a couple of months late in responding, all it did is suck up float. It didn't ever impact their project's critical path. But what the contractor was able to demonstrate in those days, a cubic yard of concrete in place was about $90 a cubic yard. In the middle of January and February, when the temperature was below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, the same cubic yard of concrete cost $300. Okay. There was all sorts of things that had to be done. Additives, mixtures to the concrete had to be done with heated water, brought on site, dumped out of the truck within 45 minutes. And there's a bunch of stuff. But the bottom line is it illustrated to me, for pretty much my experience, the very first time, productivity loss and damages from lost productivity are entirely separable from project delay. Okay, now delay typically does tend to cause something about productivity, but productivity does not necessarily impact the critical path or impact the end date of the project. So yeah, they are separable, and you're exactly correct in your question. If this activity has an amount of float on it, the productivity is screwed up by something the employer did or failed to do, and it took longer, but it still didn't hit the critical path, yeah, no delay. But that doesn't mean the owners and the employer rather is entitled to walk away from the damages caused by the productivity loss.
Okay. With that, Jim, thank you so much for the RP and for taking the time, for this webinar and for your work in general. And I'd like to thank all those who attended in person and all those who attended online. And as I mentioned, we will strive to answer your questions, even if we try to dedicate maybe a video for it or something. We'll see. We'll discuss how we can. Yes.
Each attendee here, including the people online, received the PowerPoint, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. If you go to the last slide on the PowerPoint, you'll see my email address there. If anybody wants to follow up, send me an email, and I will do my best to respond relatively promptly, given all the workload that I have. But yeah, that may be one way to do it. And Waleed, what I'll do is I'll copy you on the question and the response so that you can put them into this record or whatever you're keeping from this.
Thank you so much, Jim.
All righty.
Have a great day, and thank you so much. And thanks for everyone. Thanks. Take care.
Have a good day, Waleed.
You too. Take care. Bye.